What is up, guys? I'm Kyle at Fortune. Today we're flexing out the Samurai and we're measuring for shocks. So every time somebody puts a lift on their truck or is looking for new shock, they're always asking, what shocks should I put on my truck? And really, unless you get a kit that is very specific on what shocks you should run, there's only one way to figure out what shocks you need, and that is going to be measuring them. Even though you're doing the same lift as somebody else, it's probably not going to end up being the same size because they depend on a lot of different things. Using a different lift spring or a different shackle, where you're going to mount your attachment points on the frame and on the axle are all going to be things that are going to change what type and what length of shock that you're going to want to use. Shocks sometimes don't seem like a big deal, but they really are, because not only is it going to change the ride and some of the control of your vehicle on and off-road, but if you get the wrong ones, it could limit your up and down travel both, and it could even damage some components, including the shock itself. Here is how I measure the shocks. This works out great and makes sure that I can get all of the articulation in my range, even have a little bit of a buffer built in, so if I lower or raise the vehicle, I can still use those same shocks. But the first thing we need to do is put our shock towers and our shock studs on the truck. Those are going to be the points that we're going to measure off of, and that's where we've got to start. Here are the shock towers we're going to use for the front. Already got some paint on them just to help with the ease of painting after we weld them in, so I'll have to scuff these up a little bit, get some bare metal showing for the welds. But it's cool, they come with these big spacers for the shock. We can change how these are configured and run shocks in different positions, so I like that a lot. They also come with this gusset, so you can fill in any gap that may be in there after you weld it on, because the frame is curved and these are straight on the bottom. For the axle mount, we're going to be running one of these shock mounts, and you can either weld it on the top part of the axle or the bottom. I'm going to go with the bottom, that way we have an opportunity to run a slightly longer shock. Here's how I have the shock tower set up right now. It's just tack welded into place. This is an old steering stabilizer, but it's going to do the trick. It's actually like the perfect length to connect the bottom shock mount with the top of the shock tower. My only concern is if later on I move this axle forward, will this still work? Even if it doesn't, I could just grind these down and shift the tower forward, or I could remove this spacer right here and move the shock. I think this is going to work. I'm going to get welded. So we've got everything welded up. Got the shock mount on the lower part of the axle there. And then we've got the shock tower up here. I only welded it on these vertical spots. I think it's going to be enough. I don't think we need to weld it any more than that. So now we'll throw a little bit of paint on here and we'll move on to welding the lower shock mounts onto the rear axle. Deciding where you're going to mount your shock towers and the mounting spot on your axle is actually a pretty big deal, because when that axle starts to articulate, you want to make sure that nothing's going to interfere with that shock. That means no steering components are going to be affected, the tires aren't going to be able to hit it, and the shock is going to be able to compress and extend without binding up and damaging anything. So looking at this from the side here, if this is our shock going straight up and down, and the force of your axle moving up is going straight up and down or pretty close to that, that means you're going to get 100% of the shock dampening out of this shock. Now there's many valving options you can get depending on what shock brand you go with. Some of the bigger ones like Bilstein, the one I'm using, I believe it's the 5125, they really only have 2 shock valving options, and really the way to think of it is the bigger the number, the more shock dampening you're getting out of that. Really, it's for heavy trucks and lighter trucks. So with the Samurai, I went with the lower numbers, which are probably still going to be a little too stiff for me, but that's okay. We'll wear them in. We'll lose a little bit of that resistance later on. Something we see a lot in the Jeep world and also with the Samurais is really just a loss of space in the rear. Right by the axle, there's that gas tank, so there isn't a lot of options for mounting shocks back there, and you'll see people start to inboard their shocks like this. So although this does allow you to still use a full length shock, because it's mounted at a 45-degree angle, you're only going to be getting half of the shock dampening out of this, so they're not going to be as effective as they normally would. If they were going straight up and down, they would be a lot more effective, but because they're at an angle, their dampening ability is reduced, because the force every time the axle goes up is this way. They're at an angle, you're just not getting everything. But because of all this junk up here, there's not anywhere to mount a shock, so you only have this little tiny room right here. So sometimes it is necessary to run them at an angle. In the Samurai, this is a problem we have. We've got the stock gas tank back there still, and we actually have a bracket from Low Range Off-Road that offers multiple different spots to mount your shocks. So you can go with a shorter shock right here, or you can go with a longer shock using the inboarding part of this. One cool thing about this option, even though you do have reduced dampening off of this angle, one cool thing that you can get out of this is you can run a really long shock right here. Now later on, if you decide to lift the vehicle, you can move it to the next outboard option, which will allow you to get more dampening out of that shock. So now that we know how we're going to mount our shocks on the frame and the axle, the next thing we need to do is flex it out and measure for what shocks we need to order. Now there's a lot of different ways to do this as well, but really that measurement is the hardest thing to find. So what I do is I go to the manufacturer's website if they're listed there, or sometimes you can find them other places, and the two numbers you need to know is the collapse length and the extended length. That's going to tell you which shock is going to fit. First, we need to go in there and actually measure the distance between the 2 points. So, like I said, you have to get it a little bit flexed out, meaning you need one side of the axle to be drooped down and the other side compressed up. That's going to show you how small your shock is going to need to be, and then also on the other side, how long it's going to need to be able to extend. And then you can use those numbers to find out which shock is going to fit from those manufacturers. All right, so here is a very crude drawing of me flexing out the Samurai on this huge rock. So this part on the top, this is one frame rail, and this is one frame rail on the other side. These circles here all represent shock mounting points, and of course this is the axle and the two tires. This is one way to do it. You can drive your truck up on it, some type of obstacle, and get it to flex out a little bit. I think the way I'm going to do it, I'm going to hook an engine hoist up next to it and kind of have a strap go through the wheel in here and then lift it up that way. If you're going to do it this way, you do need to be careful to not roll your vehicle over on its side or flop it on its side. If you have a really flexy truck and it's getting high up off the ground and you're not maxing out the suspension, then yeah, you might want to tether off your roll bar to a tree or something just to make sure that you know when it's going to eventually tip over and flop. It's a whole nother set of issues that you don't want to deal with. It's nice to have that flex, but not when it's on its side. So we've got it flexed out. Here's what we're going to want to do. We need to measure this distance right here on the compressed side. That's going to be measuring from shock mounting surface to shock mounting surface, which in my case is going to be shock eyes, meaning there is a circle opening with a bushing on both ends, up and down. I like to go with those bushings because I think it's a lot easier to mount them opposed to one that goes up and has like threads on the end and you put the nut on it, just a stud. These ones at the end of your shock have an eye like this with a bushing, and you can slide a bolt through it. I think they rotate a little bit better as well, so I think they last a little bit longer and offer you more movement. After this thing is flexed out, we need to measure this distance. This is the collapsed length we're going to be looking for, and then this distance right here is the extended length that we're looking for. So right here, say this is 12 inches. if this distance right here is only 12 inches, you want a shock that can actually be compressed down to 11 inches. That's going to give us a 1-inch margin of error, saying if maybe we measured it wrong or something like that. And also, if you decide to lower your vehicle even a little bit by maybe a 1-inch shorter shackle, which would actually net you a 1/2 inch of lift loss, you can still use these same shocks. And even the cheapest shocks, I think, are about 50 bucks, the ones I've seen. So you don't want to waste that money. You want to be able to reuse those shocks. It's pretty much the same thing on the other end. This extended length, we'll just say it's 30 inches on this side. If 30 inches as far as your axle droops down on this side, then you would want a shock that is 31 inches long. Once again, that way we have a little bit of margin of error if we were measuring wrong, and also if we get something that's going to allow our vehicle to flex a little bit more, like missing links in the Samurai world or a revolver shackle in the Jeep world, something like that. I'm not recommending either of those because I don't have any experience with either. I'm just saying they can allow a little bit more droop. So that way you have that 1 inch in there. And also, if you decide to lift your vehicle later on by a little bit, maybe an inch, you can still use that same shock and still have the same amount of flex, which is really nice. So our total shock dimensions that we're looking for are 11-inch collapse and 31-inch extended. I just made these numbers up, so don't go looking for shocks that have these. It's not going to work. All right, so the next thing we need to do is flex the Samurai out and see what kind of dimensions we're getting so we know what shocks to order. Now remember, it's not going to be the same front and back. It shouldn't be. At least, you know, the chances of that are pretty insane. So it looks like this front driver's side tire is stopped moving upward. You can see that spring is, boom, way inverted. That right there is probably why they don't last long. But we've got plenty of room all around. Should be no problem with interference of the shock, because the shock mount on the other side is like right here. So tire is going to be well clear of it, it looks like. But look how much room we've got up here. A ton. We've probably got about, I don't know, 3 inches at the closest point. And right here, I'm probably going to take a hammer and hammer this in a little bit, get it out of the way. But the rear's considerably more flexed out. I mean, that's a pretty good gap. I'm not sure how much it is yet. I haven't started measuring, but I don't have my rear shock mounts on yet. They're going to be going right there. And I should have a lot of adjustability because I have the shock tower up there that's got a couple different spots in it. Looking at the rear, also ton of room. I mean, I could probably go up to a 32 in the rear and not have any problems right now. 33, just have to do a little bit of bending some of that trim back. I'm gonna measure for the compression. I need to know how small my shock needs to be, give it about 1 inch margin of error, and then we'll just use as much of the extended length as we possibly can. All right, let's get measuring. It was a little bit disappointing for the Samurai ordering shocks because the dimensions I had were just so close to being able to get a really long shock in there. Not that I was going to need 14 inches of travel, but later on when I get the Samurai a little bit bigger, which I'm guessing is just inevitable, it would be nice to have that giant shock in there because I could just use it for all sorts of different applications. The reason why I couldn't go with a 14-inch shock is because the valving was for the heavier trucks. If they would have made a 14-inch shock when the lighter valving to go for the Samurai, I totally would have got that big shock. The one I ended up going with is approximately 12 inches of travel, which is more than enough for the Samurai. You'll see when I get it mounted up, I'm gonna have a little bit extra room on the collapse length and the extended length, which I mentioned earlier was a good thing because it does allow me to be a little bit more flexible with the different mounting options, and I can also change my lift around without having to buy new shocks. All right, I've got some STP all-purpose grease. What I'm gonna do is make sure that there's some grease on the bolt that goes through this top hole to keep that lubed up. And then on the stud down here, I'm gonna rub some grease around that. So this is lubricated too. And because this is a stud, we'll have to mount that end first, and then we'll line it up with the tower, push it through, and then hopefully it won't be too hard to slide that bolt through. Just threading this on for now. I just want to make sure this doesn't come out while I try to put the top on, because I might be putting a lot of pressure on there and I don't want to slip off and smack something. Be careful while you do this. You can smash your hand in here. Oh man, that's a lot. Now we can take this band off. Hopefully we won't have to do this again because these things really come in handy. So I know that was a lot of information to take in, and like I said in some of my other videos, I'm not an expert. I've never had any training on any of this stuff, but there's always somebody that has to make a comment about how they designed shocks for the space shuttle and they worked for NASA and they have a Nobel Peace Prize and all this stuff. And you know, I just totally messed up everything, and I get it, everyone has a different opinion, but I've done this literally on every truck I've had and it's always worked great. My shocks always cycled exactly how I wanted them to. They never limited me. So I wouldn't put this out there if I didn't think it was a good idea to measure them this way. And I really hope this helps you guys figure out what shocks you need. I will put a link down in the description to the shocks I went with, but don't just order them because those are the ones I went with. They might not fit your application. Really excited to get the Samurai Flexed out and see it off-road. It's coming up very shortly. After this video, we're gonna have a front bumper update because I've got that almost ready. And then the next one after that is going to be a quick shakedown run we're going to go do on an upcoming camping trip, and really excited about both of those. So if you haven't subscribed yet, go down there and do that. Then you'll know when my new videos come out and you'll be able to see those two updates for the Samurai. I'm really excited to get it off road and see how this build went, and you know what I messed up and what's working great. So hopefully you guys can learn from both of those things, my successes and my mistakes. Thanks for watching, guys. See you next time.